Okay, ladies and ladymen, I want to make a video about the legitimacy of canon events in Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. Let's just see. Oh no. But angry people on Twitter said I can't make a video about something if the topic's already been talked about. What do I do? Okay, yeah, I'm certainly far from the first person to fire off this take. However, from what I've seen of other similar videos, the analysis tends to be a little off base in my opinion. They overblow certain details, minimize others, and come to conclusions that are on the surface nearly the same as my own. But once you dig a little deeper, well, I've got some other things to say. And hey, with Across the Spider-Verse now available on digital platforms, this is not a sponsored video, I might as well throw my hat into the ring. First off, if you haven't seen Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, 2 questions for you. Why? And why are you here? Go watch it, it's fantastic. Regardless, here's a quick recap of the topic of the day. Canon events. According to Miguel O'Hara, the Spider-Man of 2099 and self-appointed leader of the Transdimensional Spider Society, canon events are
the connections that bind our lives together.
Major milestones, good and bad, that occur in every Spider variant story throughout the multiverse. More than anything, they are what define a universe's equivalent to Spider-Man and separates them from any other character. We're shown several examples of canon events during Miguel's presentation, and we will get to those as they become relevant. What Miguel stresses most, though, is that disrupting one of these events, creating an anomaly and breaking the canon, has the disastrous consequence of tearing apart reality itself. He claims that he experienced this himself when he tried to replace a Family Man variant of himself in another universe, and he also insists that Miles has caused it to happen to Mumbadan. And yes, put a pin in both of those. Finally, Miguel says that Miles is the original anomaly, having been bitten by a spider that was forcefully taken from another universe, leaving that universe, Earth 42, without a Spider-Man, Earth 1610's Peter Parker dead, and Miles as the unrightful replacement.
Got all that? Cool. So here's the thing, it's all wrong. CinemaSins, ding. But unlike a lot of other people, I'm not saying that Miguel is maliciously deceiving others, nor am I even really claiming that he simply doesn't know enough about canon events.
Quite frankly, that's as silly as saying Gwen's a bad person for being manipulated.
What I am saying is that Miguel already has a conclusion in mind and is working backwards to contrive evidence for that conclusion, a tactic he's doubling down on due to his trauma turning into bitterness and envy. Yay!
Alright, let's take a step back. Like I said, I'm not alone in thinking Miguel is wrong about the nature of canon events, but there are a few common criticisms I've seen thrown around that I think miss the mark a little. For one, many people will point out how much these canon events can vary in their specific details. An example of this would be the Uncle Ben event. While in a whole lot of the Spider People's cases, including Miles, hey look, another pin, this moment is specifically the death of their uncle, this isn't consistent. For Gwen, it was her best friend, for Penny, it was her father, and so on. Similarly, the significant ASM-90, the canon event in which a police captain is killed trying to save a kid from falling rubble during a battle with a supervillain. A prime example given focus is George Stacy's death in The Amazing Spider-Man. But in that movie, there were only 3 characters present during the fight. Spider-Man, the Lizard, and Captain Stacy. No child in sight. As many a skeptic would say, don't all of these differences in the supposed canon already call the concept into question? As a fellow skeptic, I'd say no. Not necessarily. The exact circumstances of these canon events are left purposefully vague. Nothing in Miguel's explanation, verbally or visually, suggests that there isn't room for some variation, as long as the fundamental elements of the moment still take place. The Uncle Ben canon event may not be dependent on the Spider-Person's literal uncle being killed in one precise way. All that likely matters is that a loved one of the Spider-Person dies in a manner that somehow instills the "with great power comes great responsibility" lesson. And with ASM-90, it can be argued that Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker himself is the kid in his case. And since George Stacy died aiding him during the fight against the Lizard, the canon event was still fulfilled.
From a certain point of view.
At the very least, I'm sure this is how Miguel would respond to those doubts and defend his stance. But therein lies the issue. Sure, canon events can have variation to them. In an infinite multiverse, that makes sense. But if that's the case, what's the limit to those variations? For instance, who's to say that a loved one has to die in order to teach that with great power comes great responsibility? Again, in an infinite multiverse, is it that hard to believe that some spider people would more or less grasp that lesson without having a tragedy first? You could argue we see that in the film. Gwen learned a lesson about her responsibilities as a superhero from Peter's death, sure, but it's not like Uncle Ben. She was already fighting crime. To some extent, she didn't need that tragedy to teach her that she should use her powers to make the world a better place. She already understood that, and Peter taught her something completely different. Same thing with ASM 90. If what counts as the kid is so flexible, what about the rest of the scenario? Does it really need to be a falling building? Does it really need to be a police captain or a battle with the supervillain? Does the captain need to die? The problem isn't that any of these differences in details necessarily debunk Miguel's rules of canon. The problem is that the line between reasonable variation and broken canon is undefined and arbitrary. And on the topic of ASM 90, let's address one of our pins, the incident in Mumbattan. During the aftermath of the Spot's attack on Earth 5101, the universe of Spider-Man India, Miles saves Inspector Singh from, you guessed it, falling rubble that nearly crushed the police captain when he went to rescue a kid. We are explicitly told that this should have been Pavitra's ASM 90, but Miles disrupted the canon event. Miles shouldn't have even been there, much less swooped in to save Inspector Singh, and Miles' actions are immediately followed by a black hole opening up in the middle of Mumbattan, which Miguel later says is the collapse of reality directly caused by breaking the canon. But there are a few issues with this. First, the one everyone points out is that this black hole doesn't resemble what happened to Miguel, but rather just seems to be more of the Spot's mess. Hell, even Miles brings this up.
That wasn't me. That was the Spot.
And one part of the Mumbattan scene that I don't see nearly enough people bring up is that certain music plays as the black hole engulfs the city. That's the Spot's theme. Even the film's score is turning to us and saying, what you're seeing right now? That's all this guy. Speaking of the Spot, the fact that he's the reason starts to hit the fan in Mumbattan is another point people like to bring up. If not for the Spot causing the Alchemax building to crumble, Inspector Singh wouldn't have been put in his near-death experience in the first place. Doesn't that mean that, if not for the Spot and in turn, Miles, Pavitra's ASM 90 wouldn't have taken place at all? Well, just like the other canon event examples, not necessarily, but all other potential explanations call Miguel's rules into question anyway. There's an argument to be made that Pavitra's canon always involved these multiverse shenanigans, but that would mean that someone making a ruckus in a different universe, even someone like the Spot, doesn't necessarily constitute an anomaly. In fact, it may be breaking the canon to crack down on it. Another possible argument is that the canon has a way of adapting to the situation. ASM 90 is essentially destiny, so even if the catastrophe that leads to it is unexpected, the event must still take place. But that obviously raises its own questions. If the canon can correct itself, then how could it ever be broken? Miles saved Inspector Singh for now, but if the canon is a self-correcting force, then he would just die at some other point and we're back on track, right? So even if we're gonna ignore the fact that this isn't a collapse of reality caused by breaking the canon, something about it doesn't work. No matter how you slice it, no matter how you try to patch up the inconsistencies, Miguel is wrong about something here. And, oh hey, look, another one of our pins. Let's talk more deeply about Miles' story. To reiterate, the spider that bit Miles wasn't from his universe 1610, and only made its way to him because it was pulled into his universe by the Kingpin scientists. Everything that happens to and because of Miles from that point on then, is breaking the canon. As Miguel puts it, Miles is the original anomaly, and anywhere he goes, he's an anomaly. One little addendum actually. So another thing people might bring up is the fact that Uncle Aaron's death is included in the examples of canon events. If Miles shouldn't even be Spider-Man in the first place, how could he have canon events? Interesting point, but not really that crazy. See, Miguel was expecting Miles. In fact, he summoned him to the Spider Society HQ specifically to teach him about canon events. So it's not that much of a stretch to say that Miguel simply put a more personal example in there to drive the point home better. Now, does that explain why Miguel is treating the death of Miles' father as an example of ASM 90, and that it must not be stopped because breaking the canon is bad? No. Because it's true, if Miles shouldn't even be Spider-Man, then he shouldn't have a canon. So while this doesn't call Miguel's rules into question, this certainly does. Okay, moving on. But once again, if we consider all of Miguel's rules, none of this checks out. Let's just consider all of the consequences of Miles' anomalous origin. His Peter Parker died, Miles became the new Spider-Man, indirectly caused the death of Aaron Davis, fought several villains and set off the origin of at least one, profoundly changed the life path of not just himself but people from other universes, and oh yeah, there's an entire universe out there that doesn't have a Spider-Man because its superpowered arachnid was stolen away. That spider should have been in someone from Earth 42, presumably that universe's Miles Morales, but because it never got a chance to do so, that version of New York is a crime-ridden hellscape, and that version of Miles is the Prowler. Now, if we take Miguel's word at face value, that even saving one side character is enough to break the canon and start tearing apart reality, wouldn't replacing a universe's protagonist and completely subverting another make both of those worlds go? But no, that doesn't happen. Earth 1610 and Earth 42 have both existed for 16 months since the canon was broken, and yet nothing. There are natural consequences of what's happened, of course, and we've already gone over those. But if they were going to cease to exist, surely that would have happened already. I mean, we don't know how long Miguel was at it before his newfound universe started to collapse, but... wait. Actually... Let's take a closer look at how Miguel's situation went down. And I do mean that literally. I want to focus on how the collapse of that reality visually appears. The entire world, aside from the spider people with their protective watches, is glitching out and vanishing. As I've already mentioned, this does not at all resemble what happens in Mumbattan, but do you know what it does make me think of? The first movie, Into the Spider-Verse. Do you remember the stakes of that film? Part of it was getting Peter, Penny, and Gwanda home so their molecules would stop going. But it was also about stopping Kingpin's collider because it threatened to destroy Earth 1610. A threat demonstrated by chunks of the city beginning to glitch out just like the spider people. We're told in that film that this is the danger of a sustained merging of dimensions. It's not breaking canon that causes the problem, it's mixing and matching universes without a care. Fisk tried to do it to give himself a family, and Miguel wasn't much different. That universe Miguel found, where he replaced his dead variant and slotted himself into his family, it collapsed not because Miguel broke the canon of that variant being dead. It collapsed because the two universes remained effectively merged for too long. But Miguel doesn't see it that way. Some have called him a liar, suggested that he is knowingly deceiving Miles and the entire Spider Society, but I disagree. Miguel O'Hara is a broken man, and in that inconsolable trauma, he has found a coping mechanism: confirmation bias. I've kind of been suggesting it all the way up to this point, but if someone tried to point out the inconsistencies in his canon rules, I have no doubt that Miguel would simply move the goalpost, maintaining that there are patterns even if very strenuous. Gwen was already a superhero, and Peter's death taught her a different lesson than the typical Uncle Ben death. Well, it taught her a thing or two about responsibility, more so related to public image, but that still counts as the canon event. There was no little kid involved in George Stacy's death in The Amazing Spider-Man. Well, Peter was technically the kid in that situation, so it still counts as the canon event. Miguel and the two allies he brings along to hunt down Miles were never even bitten by a spider. Well, we weren't literally bitten by a spider, but we all kind of had our own metaphorical spider bites, so it still counts as the canon event. There's a fleet of Star Destroyers rising out of nowhere?
Well, somehow Palpatine returned.
So on and so forth. Like a nutjob conspiracy theorist, Miguel has already decided his conclusion, that canon events exist and that disrupting them destroys reality, and is working backwards to see the patterns, no matter how much of a stretch, that support that conclusion. He isn't lying to the people around him, he truly believes this. Or at least wants to believe this. And the reason he wants to believe it is that it makes what happened to him easier to process. It makes it so there's a natural order to the tragedy and that he didn't fail in some unique, personal way. It's just the way things are. And so it becomes easier to understand why, during the events of Across the Spider-Verse, Miguel has become as bitter, stubborn, and ruthless as he has. He's angry because he's been confronted by someone who succeeded where he's failed. There are a lot of similarities between Miguel O'Hara and Miles Morales. They're both half Latino dudes in black and red suits who take up the mantle of Spider-Man after Peter Parker's death, both pursuing the same mission statement as their predecessor while going about things their own distinct way. Surely these similarities aren't lost on Miguel. He has to see a bit of himself in Miles, and that's why the younger Spidey's existence frustrates him so much. Here's a kid so similar to Miguel who, despite being an anomaly in his world, which, unlike Miguel, wasn't his decision to make, hasn't caused the fabric of his reality to be torn apart. In fact, Miles actively prevented that from happening. And he's not just surviving, he's thriving. Sure, he has all the stresses, social conflicts, and bad luck that any spider person has, except this guy apparently. But all things considered, he's doing alright, he's figuring it out. And if that's the case, then Miguel has to face the harsh truth that his explanation for why it all went wrong doesn't hold much water. He has to face the fact that he personally and uniquely screwed up, and the tragedy wasn't as inevitable as he'd like to believe. Miguel's failure isn't reflected in Miles, meaning the failure is Miguel's alone. And he just can't accept that. That's why canon events have to be a thing. That's why anomalies have to be destructive. And that's why Miles' existence has to be the root of all of these problems. My prediction is that in Beyond the Spider-Verse, whenever that film actually happens, Miguel O'Hara's defeat isn't going to be in the form of losing another fight to Miles or Gwen or whoever else. It's gonna be when he sees Miles, the kid that shouldn't be, triumph over the Spot and save his father, doing exactly what he should not have been able to. The point at which Miguel will have nowhere else to move his goalpost. Though if we're gonna talk specifics, there are a lot of ways they could go about that whole situation. So many possibilities for the next movie. For example, they could treat their animators well. A big thank you to my channel members, Antis Munchie, Satellaview64, and Tim Fillion. Your support really means the most.